In 2012, Daniel Craig gave an interview explaining why his series of James Bond films had tended to be darker in tone than Pierce Brosnan's often, shall we say, ridiculous spy escapades. We had to destroy the myth because the Austin Powers movies fucked us, Craig said. I am a huge Mike Myers fan, so don't get me wrong, but he kind of fucked us. It made it impossible to do the gags. Despite their willingness to embrace the occasional joke, these newer James Bond films have broken several cardinal rules of the franchise. The tone of the stories are much darker, involving death, deception, and really mopey sex. Everybody's brooding. There's much more of an attempt to get into the psyche of Bond, rather than just going on fun adventures with him. Instead of colorful villains with dumb gimmicks, these new bad guys are always connected to Bond. They're either former agents of his boss, or his adoptive brother, or, I don't know, some other variation. Each of them try to connect stories from the previous film. They share motivations. They attempt to bring emotional resonance to a series of spy films that previously wasn't interested in that. You know, this would have been a lot more topical if No Time to Die had come out in April as intended, but then the coronavirus fucked everything over, and the world is bad now. So anyway, let's talk about Star Trek. Even though Star Trek shares very little in common with James Bond, we can see similar trends in both the sci-fi and the spy genres. Aside from the occasional Seth MacFarlane starring exception in a sitcom or two, the general rule in both science fiction and spy genre entries has been to go dark and serious. The Expanse is probably the most emblematic current example of this trend. It blends 2001 style realism and the noir genre into a heady sci-fi cocktail that is decidedly un-Trek. And that's not bad, but it does leave us with an important question. What do we do with Star Trek in a genre landscape in which it is no longer the dominant trend? That's what I want to talk about today, because a lot of noise has been made about these new Star Trek shows, especially on YouTube. A lot of digital ink has been spilled. In case all of that wasn't enough, I'm here to try and make sense of what's going on in Star Trek land the past couple of years, and if not for you, then at least for me. I'm also going to talk and rant about Star Trek as much as I possibly can tolerate without giving into the blind hate mob of Discovery and Picard. But don't worry, they're bad, and I'm going to talk about that. A half-hearted defense of two bad shows. Part 1. How we got here. I see a lot of people talking about how Star Trek Discovery isn't like The Next Generation or Deep Space Nine, and my gut response is to go, well, of course they aren't, you dumbass. Those shows are 30 years old. Why should the new shows look anything like that? But that would be really condescending, so I just shut up and save it for the internet so I can be condescending to YouTube instead of to my friends, who have to go through enough shit already. A lot has happened in the decades between the last time that Star Trek has had multiple movies and TV shows coming out or in development, and this time that Star Trek has multiple movies and TV shows either coming out or in development. The entertainment landscape is very different from what it was back then, so what changed? There are several answers to this question, one of which is more specific to sci-fi, one of which is more specific to TV in general, and one of which is specific to the corporate overlords of Star Trek. So let's talk about that. Now, the first answer comes in the form of Babylon 5 and Battlestar Galactica. Those shows were so good and so revolutionary that they fucked over anybody who came after them. Babylon 5 changed the game by making a 5-year overarching story a reality. The type of storytelling that Star Trek relied on for years, single, self-contained stories, could not fly anymore. Deep Space Nine, the show that may or may not be a complete ripoff of Babylon 5, incorporated at least some series-long story arcs into the existing Star Trek formula. Star Trek Enterprise is another example, with each season containing their own extended story arc. And Battlestar Galactica changed the game by making science fiction much more gritty, dark, and down to earth. No longer could a science fiction show be optimistic or happy or deal with any other plot line besides the extinction of human life as we know it. Sex, previously not taboo so much as in the corner, but we don't really talk about it, is something that happens all the time in these shows. We gotta have everybody bang on the daily. Finally, we have the fact that the TV landscape outside of science fiction is also very different. Streamers, like the ones that Star Trek is now on, are the dominant force in television. People binge watch shit now. Instead of watching one episode of a TV show a week, most people are expected to watch whole seasons, if not more, at once. Now, there are exceptions, including Star Trek and The Mandalorian, which drop once a week, but binging is generally the rule now. And as a result, TV shows are becoming much more expensive, much more cinematic, and much larger in scale than they used to be. Because of that, the pecking order of the entertainment industry is changing. It's no longer a death sentence for a movie star to appear in a TV show. And finally, Star Trek itself is at a very different place than it was all those years ago. After Paramount decided, for some reason, not to buy Disney, and let Disney take care of that dead horse, Star Trek is one of the few franchises that Viacom CBS has. It's one of their crown jewels alongside Transformers, Mission Impossible, SpongeBob, and well, I guess you could count Sonic now. Granted, Star Trek has always been a big moneymaker for Viacom, but the business model has changed. Star Trek needs to be Paramount's Game of Thrones. It needs to be their must-have TV show that everybody has to watch. And that means taking it out of low-budget TV jail and making it a show for everybody, your co-workers at work. It's no longer for you and your nerd friends. Same thing happened to the movies, but just 10 years earlier. I'm tempted to complain about how these changes negatively affect the stories, and trust me, I will, but I also have to accept those changes because there's nothing I can do about them. There's nothing we can do to change the fact that Star Trek is not and cannot be what it used to be. I try to not be the one who's crying over spilt Kanar. Things change, and we need to make the best of what's available now. That's why I'm here talking about this with you. Part 2. Star Trek's themes. One of the most common criticisms by fans of Trek is that these new series don't get or don't understand what Star Trek is about. Sometimes that extends to personal attacks at the creative team, which is understandable, but not my style. One might compare, for example, the positively utopian world of Star Trek The Next Generation with the moody, more violent world of Discovery or Star Trek Picard. 30 years ago, Picard and his friends were sipping tea.
Tea Earl Grey hot.
They were doing theater. They were listening to violin concerts. taking mud baths. Wait, scratch that one. It was stupid. You get my point. Picard and his friends in 2020 are fighting a much more desperate battle with much fewer resources against a much more powerful enemy. 709 pretends to spare an old enemy for the sake of Picard, then murders what may or may not be her ex-lover after he beams away. The Dr. Scientist lady murders her ex-lover, fearing a possible end of existence of life as we know it scenario. Can I just complain as an aside that I find it very annoying that Star Trek Picard Season 1 and Star Trek Discovery Season 2 have basically the same antagonist with the same threat? Okay, whatever. You might have seen this tweet from RedLetterMedia noting that a lot of Picard's new friends are violent, broken, or damaged people. Apparently that, in and of itself, devoid of context or commentary, counts as criticism in the year of our Lord 2020. Even though RedLetterMedia is very, obviously, hilariously wrong, they do have a point, or at least something approaching one. I think it is valuable and important to talk about what these new shows are doing with the themes of Trek and try to have a discussion about it, just as long as we shy away from the whole new thing not like old thing argument. Let me explain. A common accusation from the likes of RLM is that these new shows flush down the toilet those themes that we talked about earlier. I would like to argue that these new shows don't so much abandon the utopian vision of the future of Gene Roddenberry so much as recontextualize it. The problem with that tweet is that, unintentionally, they pointed out what the show is about. These shows don't get rid of the utopian vision, but they just make room for it in what they see as a much darker world. Star Trek Picard, at its thematic level, is about a man, Picard, and his crewmates, all of which either make mistakes or are suffering from past mistakes, each learning to choose to be better and to choose to hope for progress in a world which seems bleak, dark, and unforgiving. At the end of the season, Robot Lady almost unleashes total genocide against human life because she's been deceived and abused by those around her, and she changes her decision only when she sees others defending her against impossible odds. Star Trek Discovery contains similar thematic beats. For example, at the end of Season 1, Michael Burnham and her crew have the option to blow up the Klingon homeworld, which would end the war but cause massive death. But they instead choose to talk peace with the Klingons. They choose the better option. At the end of Season 2, the Klingons join them in fighting their new enemy. I would argue that these new Star Trek shows do understand the central message of Star Trek. They just have a different interpretation of it, and that's okay. There have been many different interpretations of Star Trek and its utopian world across the years. Anybody remember this?
Establish a dialogue. What the hell does she think I've been trying to do?
Commander.
Just because a group of people belong to the Federation, it does not mean that they are saints.
Excuse me.
Do you know what the trouble is?
No.
The trouble is Earth.
Really?
On Earth, there is no poverty, no crime, no war. You look out the window of Starfleet headquarters and you see paradise. Well, it's easy to be a saint in paradise, but the Maquis do not live in paradise. Out there, in the demilitarized zone, all the problems haven't been solved yet. Out there are no saints, just people. Angry, scared, determined people who are going to do whatever it takes to survive, whether it meets with the Federation approval or not.
Makes sense to me.
This brings me to discussing the other extreme of Star Trek. The first couple seasons of TNG. A lot of what certain corners of the internet have brought against these new Star Treks comes from the Next Generation in particular, but that era of Star Trek in general. Now, this is logical to compare the current era of the franchise to the previous one, but we also need to remember that this wasn't the first interpretation of the franchise. The original Star Trek was a lot more bellicose and a lot more violent than TNG. There were a lot of fist fights, phaser fights, Lirpa fights. You get the rhythm. Kirk kissed a lot of green-haired alien babes, and he punched a lot of aliens. And there's nothing wrong, thematically, with that. The whole utopian vision started with the Next Generation. And it sucked. A lot of people like to forget just how bad the first 2 seasons of TNG were. I, too, don't like to remember the episode where Riker gets infected by a virus and he has to undergo a clip show inside of his head to get cured. But you have to remember that that was about as much of a pure and unadulterated utopian Trek as you can get.
I don't think you can sustain a show where the characters are not accessible to the audience, where you don't see somebody overcoming a flaw. If there is no conflict and no tension between people, then there is no relationship between people, and that show will wither.
You can't have a completed utopian vision, because that means you wouldn't be writing a show that people can identify with.
There was no evil.
There's no money anymore.
There was no jealousy.
There's no fighting anymore.
No separate individual goals or ideas.
We negotiate.
No tension. What?
If our people are perfect and have no problems or conflicts between them, there is no story here.
We would walk around in each other's offices going, I don't know how to write about that. I don't know how to write about perfect people.
That was Gene's vision of Star Trek The Next Generation. Take it or leave it, and work within it or don't.
Part 3. These shows I praised are bad, actually. There's only so long that I can bumble around making noise being a hipster contrarian before I have to circle around and admit that these shows are bad, actually. Not that this is like a controversial opinion or anything for anyone who is okay with other people having the same opinions that they do, but rest assured, they are bad. Discovery especially, but Picard too. There's one big reason that I don't like both of these shows very much, but let's have a little bit of fun before we get there, because I know you guys were smelling blood in the water, so let's get that out of the way before we get into the serious criticism. Star Trek Discovery makes a lot more sense when you realize just how chaotic its development has been. In 3 seasons of existence, it has gone through 3 teams of showrunners, 2 of which were fired for being verbally abusive to the staff, first of which was fired because he wanted to do his own thing, and then there was the time that they fired an unrelated writer because he refused to stop saying the N-word. Point is, it's had a long and chaotic road to the screen, and it's still in the process of figuring itself out as a TV show. And all of this is readily apparent. Both seasons feature an abrupt shift in tone and storytelling at some place in the middle. Both of them feature dramatic reveals that are supposed to be shocking and intense, but they just come off as kinda stupid. Remember that epic moment when the security officer with a traumatic history of sexual abuse turned out to be a secret Klingon agent that was merged, implanted, skin graft into a human body to become a spy, and then he murdered the husband of the engineer who uses his own body merged with space slug DNA to allow the ship to transport along a network of living spores throughout the galaxy? And remember the epic moment when the captain turned out to be from the mirror universe and using the whole Klingon war thing, which up until that point he was fanatically obsessed about? Weird for a person who just wanted to return to his home dimension this whole time, and then brought his ship into the mirror universe to wreak revenge on the Emperor of the Terran Empire, who also happened to be the mirror version of the dead captain from the pilot episode, and then in their final engagement, Burnham beams her mirror universe surrogate mother over to their ship to bring it back with her to the universe only to become a Section 31 agent. And then remember the time when there was a future person in a time travel suit, and that future person in a time travel suit turned out to be Michael's long-dead mom, who's traveling back in time to prevent an apocalypse by an AI Starfleet created in the future present, and then the reanimated corpse of another Section 31 agent possessed by an evil AI computer convinced Mirror Universe lady to take a space flash drive and transfer some important files to him to complete the evil. And it turns out that this whole time the evil reanimated corpse before he was turned into an evil reanimated corpse was the guy who left Michael's mom left to die, who is not dead, and she's also in the room. Oh, and did I mention the time the doctor husband guy, the guy from Rent, got reborn after he got murdered because of an interdimensional parasite who attached herself to this lady and then sacrificed herself to give that guy a new body after bonding with this lady and then taking the shape of her best friend who died. Yeah, that was weird. Is it just me, or is this camera making me dizzy? crazy twists that change the tone of previous episodes try to happen so often in the first 2 seasons that it feels like a bad game of Mad Libs. What's more likely is that the writers really had no idea where they're going and were writing while they were filming and constantly felt the need to up the stakes and be smarter than the audience. And by comparison, the badness in Star Trek Picard is pretty sedate. It's just a 5 out of 10 show that I never really felt invested in and never really hated either. But it did have one pretty okay episode. So, as an exercise in serious criticism, I want to compare and contrast 2 episodes, one from Picard and one from Discovery, in order to show where these shows are going wrong and what we need to change in the future. The episodes in question are Season 1, Episode 7 of Picard, Nepenthe, and Season 2, Episode 9 of Discovery, Project Daedalus. Nepenthe begins where the previous episode left off, with Picard and Data's daughter, Soji, beaming to a planet where Picard's former colleagues Riker and Deanna are living in retirement. Meanwhile, Elnor and Hugh the Borg face off against Romulans on a recovered Borg ship, and Picard's ship and his crewmates try to dodge somebody who's tracking them. But the majority of the runtime, and why the episode is so well liked, at least according to me, is that the majority of the episode is just dedicated to the emotional states of the characters. Soji spends the episode dealing with the revelation that she's not a robot, and Picard, Riker, and Deanna Troi deal with the ghosts of their past, including a son who died because he couldn't get the treatment he needed. Over the episode, Soji and Picard develop a bond and trust while their friends deal with, the plot shit. And that doesn't stop the plot-related shenanigans from being boring as shit, but there's a lot less to deal with compared with the other episodes. Meanwhile, Project Daedalus begins somewhat similarly with the augmented human, Lieutenant Commander Ariam, who before this episode was one of those characters who just sort of sits on the bridge and presses buttons, but doesn't have that much to do besides that, and she's reviewing her memories. She can't keep them all in her head with her enhancements, so she decides which ones to keep in a computer and which ones to leave behind. We are reminded that in previous episodes her computer parts were hacked by some unknown source. The crew, including an admiral, reviews the footage of Spock's supposed murder of guards and then discovers it has all been faked. Their mission is to reach the AI called Control, a Section 31 invention that had been previously used to threat assessment calculations, but now had been upgraded since the Klingon War to predict future wars and be more proactive. Ooh. It is suspected that the AI may be becoming dangerously self-aware. The ship reaches the base after dodging some mines, and then Ariam beams over alongside Burnham and some other characters. They discover all the inhabitants of the station were murdered by the AI, and then it is revealed that Ariam was hacked by this same AI to deliver data from Discovery, who had previously discovered, in another episode that I'm not going to mention because it's going to take too long, a giant ancient sphere archive that had a lot of data about everything ever in existence. And before the Ariam character can do this, Burnham and Alien Lady eject her into space, and this is supposed to be very sad. The next episode begins with a 10-minute eulogy to a character we had never known before this episode in order to try and make us feel emotional. It doesn't work. And this is where I admit that there is one episode in The Next Generation that it does indeed have over these new shows, but it's not what you think. Like Discovery, the first 2 seasons of TNG were very bad, like I said earlier. And yes, it's because of the utopian philosophy of Gene Roddenberry that dictated that nobody in the crew could have conflicts or disagreements with each other, but that changed. How did it change? Well, in the 3rd season of Star Trek, existing showrunner Maurice Hurley left, and Michael Piller was hired as his replacement. He tidied up the writer's room, he organized the creative process, and he instituted a very important change.
And Michael, along with Rick, found a way to make the show work better.
Michael refocused the show
he said, this is all about our characters. This is a Worf story. This is a Picard story. This is a Data story. How is this episode going to affect one of our people and make it a character-oriented show in that sense? And that fundamentally shifted the direction of everything.
Michael Piller was very adept at creating conflict between characters that was so organic that you didn't question it.
Before this, TNG had existed entirely of Monster of the Week episodes. The monster shows up, the Enterprise crew has to fight it, they kill it, and the episode is over. We rum up the moral. Very 60s sci-fi storytelling. But that gets old and boring. But with Michael Piller, the formula changed. The episode could be a Monster of the Week episode, or it could be something completely different. But regardless, it was always focused on one or more of their characters. The conflict always has to do with an issue or a personality trait of one of our characters. It could be about Data's struggle to be human. It could be about Picard's love life. It could be about Worf's struggle with his identity. But it's always about one of them. And this is the important innovation that these new shows don't have. Nepenthe works as well as it does because it feels like that old-style Star Trek episode. It's not really about the plot so much as it is about the characters. And the plot is boring as shit, but you can ignore that. Project Daedalus, on the other hand, is frustrating because in its first few minutes, it promises to be like that. I wanted a bottle episode where I just got to learn about Lieutenant Commander Ariam. What's she like? What does she want? What are her issues? Let's just have an episode without plot. Let's just talk to her about it. And then it turns out that the only reason why they focused on her in the beginning of the episode was try and force a cheap emotional reaction out of you at the end. And it doesn't feel earned, because before this episode, we knew nothing about her. It's so manipulative and cheap. The death of Tasha Yar by the tar monster had more dramatic weight than this did. Being a plot-focused show isn't necessarily the problem. The problem is that they focus on plot over character. And when it's a mystery plot, it just gets old real quick. They string you along from reveal to reveal, and they keep trying to be cleverer than you, and I just didn't care because the characters aren't interesting. I had to force myself to keep watching these shows for this video. I wanted to give up several times. And the most frustrating part is when they get close to doing something, anything interesting with these characters, the plot shows up, and then we're shuffled on to half and other things that I'm supposed to care about instead of the characters. They don't slow down, and they don't make each episode about one character, one story. So Picard and Discovery, instead they blend together all of their plots for all of their characters into each and every episode. It's distracting and it's frustrating to be jerked from one subplot to another without any sort of revolution or focus. And then at the end of the season, they try to resolve everything, and it's either satisfying or it's not, depending on how well set up the show has been, but that's not really the point. No matter how much I may enjoy the season finale or not, it's not worth the time I invested in getting there. I shouldn't have to watch an entire season of a TV show to get a satisfying story. If you don't justify me spending my time on your show each and every episode I watch, then I don't see why I should be watching it at all. And to be clear, this is far from just a Star Trek problem, but it's more obvious in Star Trek because of what it used to be. It's also a Stranger Things problem. It's also a His Dark Materials problem, and a whatever TV show you like that came out this year problem. I don't like it, so please stop it. The average experience of watching a Discovery or a Picard episode consists in me yelling at the screen for them to slow down and let the characters breathe. Discovery especially takes so many different turns and twists in its story that it feels like an overactive child who is afraid of losing my attention. The camera constantly moves and spins even when there's no motivation for it to do. It's honestly really distracting. Picard does do a better job at balancing story and character, but it does have the same problem. The first 5 episodes are incredibly boring because they're all concerned about getting the characters where they need to be for the next bit of the plot to happen, then letting that plot happen, then moving them on to the next bit. We never really get into the characters' heads. Picard in particular is incredibly underdeveloped. He's always right. He made some mistakes 20 years ago and burned some bridges, but he never regrets what he did, and he never has doubts about what he's doing now or any qualms or misgivings. He's too perfect. Everybody around him let him down, and nothing is his fault. It's boring. Just canonize him in the Catholic Church already and get him off the screen. Part 4. Now that you're done rambling, so what? I keep saying that I'm willing to give these new shows the benefit of the doubt. The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, all these shows took several seasons to find their groove, so I should give these new shows that same benefit of the doubt. But I'm starting to wonder if that's less a reasonable position to take and more of the sunk cost fallacy. I've invested so much of my time in watching Star Trek new and old. I go back and I watch TNG and DS9 and Voyager more than is probably healthy. I keep holding out, waiting for a new show to relive the experiences I had watching these old ones. And the question is, what else can you do? You can either accept what they're doing or stop watching. And this isn't gonna stop. It's gonna get worse. Paramount has 2 movie scripts for Star Trek films in development, and CBS and Alex Kurtzman are currently developing more Star Trek shows than I can count. Something in me feels like all of this is a little bit much. And here's the bottom line. I can't really ask that these shows reflect what my memories of TNG and DS9 are, and to be honest, they probably shouldn't. All I can really ask, all I can hope for at this point, is that they take what worked from those old shows and make it into something new. I can only ask that they find a way to do that.